Chanel No. 5's formula is locked in a safe. It names every material, every proportion. But in 1988, Jacques Polge said that stealing it still would not tell you what to do with it. The page is not worthless. The numbers are not false. The formula is necessary. It is simply not the perfume. Missing from the paper are the trained memory to recognize materials, the judgment to reject a bad batch, and the patience to compare what a trial becomes tomorrow. This is the hidden work of a perfumer, and it begins long before the safe. Around 1969, Jacques Polge enters the fragrance world of Grasse after studying literature. In a 1984 interview, he describes one of his first exercises. For 3 months, he learns to recognize individual materials on dipped paper strips. One strip, one material. Smell it. Name it. Return to it. By 1984, he says he has continued this paper strip practice for 15 years. That detail overturns the easiest myth about the profession. A perfumer is often called a nose, as though the occupation begins with a rare organ and ends with inspiration. Polge describes something less magical and more demanding. The nose is trained through continuous repetitive exercise. Later, occupational records from the International Perfume Museum and UNESCO make the same point more broadly. Professional composition depends on memory, imagination, creativity, and a material vocabulary enriched throughout a career. The worker is not merely detecting an odor, he is learning where that odor belongs among thousands of possible relationships. The first hidden shift is therefore not mixing, it is remembering. In 1978, Chanel appoints Polge as its third house perfumer. He is about 35, and every scene in this story belongs to his verified adult career. We do not invent an appointment meeting, a private diary, or a secret brief. What the record does show is the responsibility attached to the role. Polge does not describe composition as raw sensitivity. He speaks about aesthetic judgment, coherence among elements, and whether a result belongs to the identity of the house. By 1988, the job is described as both creator and monitor, making new work, but also testing the quality of primary materials, so existing fragrances can remain recognizable. That is a very different occupation from finding one pleasant smell. You are trying to make an invisible structure hold its shape. The formula is part of that structure. Polge explains that a perfume formula lists primary materials and the proportion of each. It is not a chemical formula. It is closer to notation. In 1984, he compares reading one to the way a musician can hear a score. With enough training, he says, he can know almost completely how the composition will smell before it is made. Almost? That word matters. The score works because the musician already knows the sound of the instruments. In the same way, a material name on the page activates years of remembered smelling. The formula does not teach that memory. It assumes it. And even memory does not solve the next problem. Suppose the page names one primary material. The proportion is correct. The notation is clear. Which physical version enters the bottle? In the 1988 interview, Polge explains that one material category can have at least 20 variants. This is his illustration, not a universal count for every substance, but the consequence is enormous. One word on paper can point toward materials that differ in origin, quality, character, and behavior. The formula can tell you how much of the name category to use. It cannot, by that name alone, guarantee that you have chosen the version the perfumer intended. The numbers can be correct while the smell is wrong. Now, the locked safe paradox becomes practical. If you possess the page but not the material knowledge behind it, you possess instructions with missing context. The next hidden shift happens after the formula is written. No recovered diary gives us one exact day at Polge's desk. But contemporary testimony and later museum records support a representative work cycle. An olfactory objective becomes a selection of materials. Identities and proportions are written. A laboratory trial is weighed and compounded. The roles must remain distinct. The perfumer composes and evaluates. Growers cultivate. Processors transform raw plants. Laboratory staff prepare trials. Manufacturing must later reproduce the result. The trial reaches a blotter. You smell it now. Then you wait. A perfume does not remain at its opening. More volatile materials leave first. Other parts emerge and persist. The museum describes compositions being followed on blotting strips over several days. So the first smell is not the verdict. The strip returns later. The composition has changed. Does the structure still hold? Does one material dominate? Has the relationship that looked balanced on paper survived time in the air? If not, the formula changes. Another trial is compounded. Another strip begins its clock. This is not a recovered Coco trial log, and the later museum workstation cannot be silently copied onto a desk in 1984. The precise tools change. The occupational logic does not. Remember, specify, compound, smell, weight, compare, reject, or revise. The palette itself is wider than the public image of fields and flowers. Modern perfumery combines natural materials with synthetic odorants made possible by organic chemistry. The French heritage record describes composition as an olfactory architecture built from both. Natural does not mean automatically better. Synthetic does not mean fake. Each is a material with a role, a quality, and a behavior inside the structure. Polge says that 60 to 100 ideas may arrive in a year, and very few become perfumes that reach the market. The unit is ideas, not finished formulas. There is no exact rejection ratio, but imagine the invisible volume of work inside that sentence. An idea may become a notation. The notation may become a trial. The trial may fail immediately or only after the blotter changes over hours and days. Technical limits, cost, material availability, coherence, and identity all narrow the field. Most of the work leaves no bottle for the public to see. One documented survivor is Coco. In December 1984, Le Monde reports that Polge has worked for more than 3 years on the combinations that became the perfume. The source does not give an exact starting day, an uninterrupted schedule, a trial count, or the proprietary ingredients. What it gives us is duration. The bottle appears in 1984. The labor has already been disappearing into revisions for more than 3 years. But launch is not the end of the occupation. A successful composition creates a second problem: how to make it again. The formula fixes relationships on paper. The world supplying those relationships keeps moving. UNESCO describes the Grasse perfume system as 3 linked domains: cultivating perfume plants, knowing and processing natural raw materials, and composing perfume. These are connected skills, not one person's job. A flower is grown. A raw material is extracted or transformed. A sample travels into a laboratory. The perfumer evaluates what that physical material does inside the composition. Change the harvest, the source, the processing, or the quality, and the same material name may no longer behave in exactly the same way. That is why the perfumer is also a monitor. In 1987, Chanel says it begins a sourcing relationship with the Moule family in Grasse, initially around jasmine. The later relationship expands to other flowers, but that later list cannot be projected backward into 1987. Nor does the record show Polge personally negotiating the agreement. What the date reveals is the institutional answer to a sensory problem. If the composition must remain recognizable, material continuity cannot be left entirely to chance. Supply becomes part of authorship. The secret is no longer contained inside one worker or one safe. It runs through fields, extraction, samples, quality checks, formula records, trial bottles, and trained comparisons. Then the story reaches a more difficult test. What happens when the worker retires, the supplier disappears, or the original material no longer exists? In January 1989, the International Perfume Museum opens in Grasse, preserving the technical, aesthetic, social, and cultural history of perfumery. On April 26, 1990, the Osmothèque opens in Versailles with a different but related mission: preserving fragile perfumes and transmitting knowledge of a profession that is still little known. Later, Osmothèque documentation explains why old perfumes can be so difficult to reconstruct. Exact qualitative and quantitative instructions may be required, but so may historical knowledge of suppliers, material qualities, and substances that have disappeared. The page can survive while part of its meaning vanishes. Modern analysis can separate a mixture and identify chemical components. Osmothèque practitioners note that chromatography is less precise when the problem is reconstructing complex natural raw materials in old perfumes. That does not make chemistry useless. It shows that measurement and historical material knowledge answer different parts of the problem. And this evidence does not concern Coco or a secret Chanel reconstruction. It is an independent preservation lesson from other historic perfumes. It also resolves the 1988 paradox. The formula matters. Without identities and proportions, there is no controlled composition to reproduce. But a formula is compressed knowledge. It points beyond itself. It points to the worker who can almost smell the page because he has spent years building a memory of materials. It points to the physical sample selected from many possible variants. It points to the trial that must be smelled now, then again after the easy opening has disappeared. It points to growers, processors, laboratory staff, sourcing systems, quality monitors, and archives that keep the material language from changing underneath the numbers. The public sees a bottle and imagines the secret is the recipe. The hidden shift is everything required to make that recipe mean the same thing twice. Steal the page, and you have the formula. Preserve the memory, the materials, the judgment, and the chain around it, and only then do you still have the perfume.